Hello and welcome to this week's edition of ISS's View on Africa. I am Andy Asamoah, a Senior Research Fellow at the ISS. The ongoing protests in Sudan started in December 2018, following the removal of subsidies on fuel and food items in Sudan by the government. And that is basically because the government, since South Sudan seceded, has been going through a lot of economic challenges. And if you look at the economic performance of Sudan, it's not been doing so well. And despite attempts by the government to try and broaden its economic base, it hasn't succeeded. So there's been a series of austerity measures to try and get hold of the country's macroeconomic indicators. So even if you look at 2018, the December price hikes weren't the first. And so people have actually been virtually trying to find a way to express their discontent against the rising cost of living in the country. So the rise in the price of fuel and food in December actually sparked off this ongoing protest. But you will need to understand that, situating it within the broader context of the country's economic situation and what the people perceive to be the main managers of the economy, which is the government. And so the protest started as a call, for the government to respond to the rising cost of living, but it has snowballed quickly into a demand for President Bashir to step aside for reforms to take place in Sudan. As we speak, the protests have continued to grow daily, and it's been so decentralized in a way that is making it very difficult for the government and security forces to respond to it. The government's response to the crisis, I would like to look at it in two ways. One is the nature of the characterization by the government of the protest itself, beyond the message that is being sold by the protesters, and how the government has responded in terms of the deployment of security actors onto the streets. If you look at how the government has characterized it, first, President Bashir has variously described it as the actions of people trying to undermine the integrity of the state. And that seems to have informed a subsequent, deployment of massive security response. And so the government's response has been very much heavy-handed. There's been a lot of arbitrary arrests, use of live ammunition, detentions of people. And so the government's ghost houses are, as we speak, bursting at the seams with all sorts of arrests of protesters. And so that has been how the government has been responding. It's been very much heavy-handed, even though various international actors have taken the opportunity to call the government to try and respect the human rights demands of its own constitution. We've not seen that, but it's really to describe the government's response as one that is really heavy-handed. For one to understand, many people think and have been asking the question whether this is really the final straw that may force President Bashir out of his, 3 decades of leadership of Sudan. And to be able to understand that, you will need to situate what is happening within the variables that have been propping President Bashir for these 3 decades. And if you look at it that way, then you are talking about his strengths in controlling the army, his hold in terms of the Islamic base, and as well as the ruling coalition. For any change to happen, the protests will have to be able to offset the government's hold on all these 3 variables. As we speak, there are some movements at the level of the coalition. We've seen at least 2 of the coalition members siding with the protesters. We've also seen some very strong condemnation from some Islamic clerics. But we are yet to see any movements of any sort, any indication of erosion in terms of the army and other allied security forces. Recently, the army chief actually gave an indication that they are solidly behind the president. So we get a sense that the actual deciding factor will come to where the army decides to support. It doesn't appear to be shifting so far. The allegiances are still intact. And what we may see happening is if the protests keep growing, then the army might be forced to reposition itself either to side with the common people or to continue with the government that is clearly, as per the protests, seem to be having its base incredibly getting eroded day by day. And so for one to say that it's going to offset the balance of power in Sudan, you will have to look at it on these three power poles. So far, the army remains the base that hasn't shifted at all. I think that one of the things we learn in this Sudan experience, not just for Sudan, but for the broader context of Africa's move towards the quest for peace and security, is that growing discontent is always a basis for the people to begin to hold their leaders accountable. And so beyond the push or the mantra, or if you like, the inscriptions on placards demanding President Bashir should go, it's a clarion call for the president or for Sudan as a country to revisit the underlying structural and political issues. And I think that message shouldn't be overlooked. Sudanese are saying they are no more content with the direction of the country, and things shouldn't remain as business as usual. I think the biggest lesson is that Sudanese are fed up with the status quo. And so the protests are a clarion call for change in the country's direction, politically as well as economically. And I think that the handwriting is on the wall for President Bashir to begin to reconsider the heavy-handed response to the protest and begin to look at it in terms of the survival of the state itself beyond himself being in power. And that is something the protesters, as they run around in being pursued by various security forces, that message clearly comes through.